Charles Schulz created Peanuts for 50 years without missing a single day. He became one of the most famous and successful cartoonists in the world, earning millions and touching millions of hearts through his characters like Charlie Brown and Snoopy. But everything changed in December 1999 after one phone call. Schulz was found crying in his studio, telling his family, "It's over." For months, he had been hiding a heartbreaking secret. His hands had started shaking, his eyesight was failing, and doctors had given him devastating news about his health. That moment marked the end of Peanuts and left fans around the world in shock. Charles Monroe Schulz was born on November 26, 1922, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His father, Carl, was a barber who had emigrated from Germany, and his mother, Dina, was a waitress before becoming a homemaker. She had Norwegian roots. The family lived simply and didn't have much money. Carl's small barber shop was close to where Dina worked, and together they tried to provide for their only child, Charles. During the Great Depression, life became even harder. The Schulz family had to move to Needles, California, for 2 difficult years. Money was tight, and the struggle to survive made a deep impression on young Charles. Watching his parents work hard to make ends meet taught him about life's quiet sadness, which later became a central theme in Peanuts. Just 2 days after he was born, his uncle gave him the nickname Sparky, after a popular cartoon horse called Sparkplug from the comic strip Barney Google. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life, and even many people in his career called him Sparky instead of Charles. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Charles was only 7. His father's barber shop began losing customers, and the family moved several times in search of stability. Living in Needles felt strange and lonely to him. He would later describe it as weird and awful. Those feelings of fear, insecurity, and loss never left him and would later show up in Charlie Brown's worries about his family and the world around him. Charles had a beloved black and white hunting dog named Spike, who was unlike any other. Spike would eat nails, rubber, tacks, and even razor blades, and somehow survive. When Charles was just 14, he drew a picture of Spike and sent it to Ripley's Believe It or Not. To his delight, it was published on February 22, 1937. That was the first time his drawing appeared in print, and it meant everything to him. Sadly, a few years earlier, when Charles was about 10, Spike had been hit by a car and died. That loss deeply affected him, and years later, Snoopy was inspired by that same beloved dog. Even though the family struggled financially, Charles's mother always supported his passion for drawing. She bought him art supplies, even when they barely had money for food. His father, however, didn't believe drawing was a real job and wanted him to follow in his footsteps as a barber. This difference created tension at home, but Dina continued to encourage her son to chase his dreams. Tragically, she became ill when Charles was still young. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer and passed away in 1943 at just 48 years old. Her death broke his heart. That same week, Charles was drafted into the army, and his mother never got to see the success her son would one day achieve. From that moment on, every drawing Charles created carried a piece of her memory. Charles started school at Richard Gordon Elementary in St. Paul, where teachers noticed his intelligence and promoted him 2 grades ahead. But this only made life harder for him. He was smaller and younger than his classmates, and he was often bullied. He became shy and withdrawn, feelings that stayed with him for life. Those emotions became the heart of Charlie Brown's character, the boy who never quite fits in, no matter how hard he tries. When Ripley's Believe It or Not published his drawing of Spike, Charles should have been proud. But instead, his classmates mocked him and said his art was silly. Even his teachers didn't seem to care. He learned early that success doesn't always bring acceptance. Sometimes it makes people treat you worse. That painful truth would echo throughout his comics. High school wasn't easy either. He struggled with classes and failed several subjects, including Latin, English, and algebra. He even got a 0 in physics. When he tried to submit his art to the school yearbook, every single drawing was rejected. The rejection crushed him. Years later, at age 53, he published his old report card to show people that he wasn't stupid, just misunderstood. In 1940, at age 17, he enrolled in a mail-order art course from the art instruction schools. It cost $170, which was a large amount for his family at the time, but his father paid for it despite the burden of medical bills. Charles studied drawing, lettering, and other techniques, often working by candlelight when they couldn't afford electricity. He reused paper and supplies until they wore out. Later, he took a small job grading art for the same school to help pay for more lessons. Through this, he learned that following your dream takes sacrifice, a lesson that shaped his life forever. In February 1943, Schulz was drafted into the U.S. Army. He served as a staff sergeant in the 20th Armored Division and led a .50 caliber machine gun squad through Europe. His unit landed in France in February 1945 and eventually reached Germany, where they arrived at the Dachau concentration camp one day after its liberation. Seeing the survivors walking near their trucks left a lasting mark on him. He rarely spoke about the war, but those experiences of fear, loss, and humanity deeply influenced his later work. Before leaving for war, he visited his dying mother one last time. During their final conversation, he told her, "We'll probably get a dog when I come back." That promise stayed with him forever, and Snoopy later became the dog he had once dreamed of sharing with her. When the war ended in 1945, Charles returned home a changed man. He was filled with grief, trauma, and loneliness. He moved back into the apartment above his father's barber shop and tried to rebuild his life through art. In July 1946, he got a job grading lessons at art instruction schools, earning very little but staying close to his passion. Some of his co-workers there would later inspire Peanuts characters. Around that time, he met Donna Mae Johnson, a red-haired accountant at the school. They became close, sharing lunches and dreams. Charles fell deeply in love and thought she was the one. But in 1950, just before Peanuts was launched, he proposed, and she said no. Donna was already engaged to another man named Al Wald. The rejection devastated Charles. He later said it was the most painful heartbreak of his life. That sorrow became the story of Charlie Brown and the little red-haired girl, the love he could never have. Charles's first comic strip was called Lil Folks, which began running on June 8, 1947, in the Minneapolis Tribune and later in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. He was paid just $10 for each publication. The strip continued until January 22, 1950, when Charles asked the editor to move it to the main comics page and increase his pay. The editor refused, and Charles was forced to quit after nearly 3 years. He was only 24, living above his dad's shop, trying to survive as an artist. Losing Lil Folks was heartbreaking, but it was also the beginning of something far greater to come. Charles Schulz didn't give up after Lil Folks ended. In 1950, he took his idea to United Feature Syndicate, hoping they would publish his new strip. But they told him that Lil Folks sounded too similar to other comics. Schulz suggested names like Charlie Brown or Good Old Charlie Brown, but the syndicate ignored him. Instead, a production manager randomly picked the name Peanuts from a list, without even reading the strip first. Schulz was humiliated. He hated the name immediately and said it had no dignity. He called it the worst name ever given to a comic strip, and he disliked it for the rest of his life. Even as Peanuts became one of the most famous comics in history, he kept asking the syndicate to change the title, but they never did. The first Peanuts strip was published on October 2, 1950, in just 7 newspapers. Schulz earned only $90 that first month, barely enough to pay his bills. To survive, he took side jobs, including lettering names on gravestones. The first strip featured Charlie Brown walking past Shermy and Patty. Shermy smiled and said, "Good old Charlie Brown." But in the last panel he added, "How I hate him." That small, dark twist showed Schulz's own complicated feelings, the mix of kindness, sadness, and frustration that defined both his art and his life. 2 days later, on October 4th, Snoopy appeared for the first time. At first, the response to Peanuts was slow. But by 1952, things began to change. The strip grew from appearing in 7 newspapers to 40, a huge leap. Schulz kept creating new characters and storylines that connected with readers. In September 1952, he introduced Linus Van Pelt as a baby. Linus later became the quiet philosopher of the strip, the one who tried to make sense of the chaos around him. When Schulz began letting Linus quote Bible verses in the late 1950s, some editors complained. One Christmas strip in 1961 featured Linus reading a sad verse from the book of Jeremiah, and several newspapers threatened to cancel Peanuts. Schulz had to make compromises. He allowed his characters to express faith, but avoided making religion the center of the story. It was the only way to keep his comic alive. Amid his growing fame, Schulz found love. On April 18, 1951, he married Joyce Halverson, a 22-year-old woman with a young daughter named Meredith. Schulz adopted Meredith and always treated her as his own child. But money was still tight. At one point, Schulz was so broke that he pawned his drawing tools just to pay the bills. Those tools were the only things keeping his dream alive, yet he refused to quit or change his artistic style, even when the syndicate tried to pressure him. Over the years, Charles and Joyce had 4 more children, but Schulz often focused so deeply on his work that people said he was emotionally distant at home. Snoopy changed everything. When he first appeared in 1950, he was just an ordinary dog who walked on all 4s and didn't speak. But on January 9, 1956, something magical happened. Snoopy stood up on 2 legs. Schulz later said that he hadn't planned it. Snoopy just did it. That one moment transformed the comic. By 1957, Snoopy was walking upright all the time, taking on wild new identities like the World War I flying ace, the frustrated writer, and the ultra-cool Joe Cool. Snoopy became a worldwide symbol, as recognizable as Mickey Mouse or Coca-Cola. Linus's famous security blanket first appeared in 1952. It was inspired by Schulz's daughter Amy, who loved carrying around her favorite blanket. Schulz never actually called it a security blanket. Readers came up with that name themselves. Around that same time, psychologists began using the term transitional object to describe items that comfort children. Some parents and experts said Linus's attachment to his blanket was unhealthy, and Schulz received angry letters. But studies later showed that nearly 70% of kids had a similar emotional connection to toys or blankets. Linus's contradictions, being both wise and dependent, made him one of Schulz's most human characters. By 1955, Peanuts appeared in over 100 newspapers. That same year, Lucy debuted her psychiatric help booth, which looked like a lemonade stand but offered life advice for 5 cents. The idea came from Schulz's own therapy sessions after World War II. Parents were confused. A kid's comic talking about mental health? But children loved it, and even real therapists began using Lucy's booth as a teaching example. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4, 1957, Schulz quickly worked it into his strip. He showed his characters watching the night sky, imagining the satellite. A year later, he even had Snoopy launch Linus into space,